They say family heirlooms carry memories, but sometimes they carry secrets too. I thought the cameras I installed after my mother's passing were just for peace of mind. I never imagined they would reveal the true nature of the woman my son married, or that a simple notification on my phone would shatter everything I believed about trust, love, and the family I thought I knew. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of my kitchen window, casting delicate patterns across the oak table where I sat with my coffee. Outside, the maple trees lining Elmwood Drive were just beginning to turn their autumn colors. A familiar sight that had greeted me for the past 32 years in this house. Some mornings like this one, I could almost hear my mother's voice drifting from the living room, calling me to hurry, or I'd be late for school. But that was just memory playing tricks on an empty house. My name is Patricia Holbrook, and at 64, I've learned that solitude and loneliness are two very different things. Since losing my mother, Dorothy, 6 months ago, I've discovered which one I'm actually living with. The house feels larger now, not because she took up much physical space. She was barely 5 feet tall in her final years, but because her presence had filled every corner with purpose. Now I move through rooms that remember her better than I do some days. I reached for the morning paper, a ritual I maintained even though most people my age had switched to reading everything on tablets. There was something comforting about the weight of the newsprint, the way the pages rustled with authority. The local section featured a story about the new community center downtown, and I found myself wondering if Mother would have enjoyed the pottery classes they were advertising. She always had artistic hands, delicate fingers that could coax beauty from the simplest materials. Those hands had also chosen each piece of jewelry in her collection with careful consideration. Every necklace, every ring, every bracelet had a story. The pearl necklace from her wedding day. The sapphire earrings Daddy gave her for their 20th anniversary. The gold charm bracelet that grew heavier each year as family milestones were commemorated with tiny symbols of love. I hadn't been able to bring myself to sort through them yet. They still sat in her mahogany jewelry box on the dresser in what used to be her bedroom, waiting for me to find the courage to decide their fate. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway pulled me from my thoughts. Through the window, I watched my son Daniel's silver sedan pull up to the house, followed closely by a compact car I didn't recognize. Daniel stepped out first, tall and lean like his father had been, wearing the kind of crisp button-down shirt that spoke of his success in pharmaceutical sales. His wife Meredith emerged from the passenger side, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing designer jeans that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. They'd been married for 3 years now, and I was still getting used to having a daughter-in-law. Meredith was pleasant enough, always polite, always appropriately dressed for family occasions. She remembered birthdays and brought wine to dinners. But there was something about her that reminded me of a showroom model. Beautiful, flawless, but somehow untouchable. I'd never been able to have the kind of easy conversation with her that I'd hoped for when Daniel first brought her home. The driver of the second car remained a mystery as Daniel and Meredith approached the front door. I opened it before they could knock, the way mothers do when they've been watching and waiting. "Good morning, Mom," Daniel said, giving me the kind of quick hug that had replaced the lingering embraces of his childhood. "Hope you don't mind us stopping by," unannounced. "Meredith had an idea she wanted to run past you." Meredith stepped forward with that practiced smile of hers, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Patricia, you look wonderful as always. I hope we're not interrupting anything important." I assured them they weren't, though part of me wondered why they hadn't called first. In the past, Daniel would have phoned to check if it was a good time to visit. But marriage changes things, I supposed. New allegiances form, new habits develop. We settled in the living room, the same room where Mother had spent her final months in the hospital bed we'd set up by the window so she could watch the birds at the feeder. I'd since moved the furniture back to its original arrangement, but sometimes I still caught myself glancing toward that corner, expecting to see her there. "So what's this idea?" I asked, settling into my favorite armchair. The one with the worn velvet arms that Mother used to say looked like it belonged in a fancy hotel lobby. Meredith perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture perfect, hands folded in her lap. Well, Daniel and I have been talking about the jewelry collection. Your mother's pieces, we know how special they are to the family, and we've been thinking about the best way to preserve their legacy. I felt a small flutter of unease, though I couldn't say why. What do you mean by preserve their legacy? Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. Mom, we know how hard it's been for you to deal with Grandma Dorothy's things. We don't want to rush you, but we also don't want those beautiful pieces just sitting there collecting dust. Meredith has a friend who runs an estate jewelry business. Very high-end, very reputable. She specializes in vintage pieces and knows how to properly value and care for them. The flutter in my chest grew stronger. Value them? Why would we need to have them valued? Meredith's smile brightened, but something in her eyes shifted. Oh, not to sell them, of course. Just to understand what we're working with. Some of those pieces looked quite valuable when I saw them at the memorial service. If something were to happen, fire, theft, anything like that, you'd want to make sure they were properly insured, wouldn't you? I thought about the jewelry box upstairs, still exactly as Mother had left it. I'd opened it only once since her death, just long enough to find the pearl earrings she'd requested be buried with her. The sight of all those pieces, each one holding decades of memories, had overwhelmed me so completely that I'd closed the lid and walked away. I appreciate the concern, I said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm ready to have strangers handling Mother's things just yet. Daniel's face took on that patient expression he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. Mom, it's been 6 months, and this isn't about strangers. This is about family taking care of family. We're not asking you to decide anything permanent. Just let Rebecca take a look. Give us some professional insight. Knowledge is power. Rebecca. So the mystery person in the second car had a name and a purpose. I found myself wondering why they'd brought her along without asking first. Why this felt less like a suggestion and more like a fait accompli. Where is this friend of yours now? I asked. She's waiting in the car, Meredith said, glancing toward the window. We didn't want to overwhelm you by bringing her in right away, but she's driven quite a distance to be here this morning. And her time is valuable. There it was. The gentle pressure, wrapped in consideration but unmistakably firm. I looked at my son, this man who used to build blanket forts with me on rainy afternoons, who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly. When had he learned to package manipulation in such reasonable-sounding language? I suppose it wouldn't hurt to have her take a quick look. I heard myself saying, though something inside me was raising alarm bells, just to get an idea of what we're dealing with. Daniel's relief was immediate and obvious. That's great, Mom. Really? You won't regret this. Rebecca is the best at what she does. Meredith was already standing, smoothing her jeans. I'll go get her. She's going to be so excited to see the collection. She mentioned that pieces from the 1940s and 50s are particularly sought after right now. As she headed for the door, I wondered how she knew where Mother's jewelry was from. I didn't remember discussing specific pieces or their ages with her, but then again, Meredith was observant. She probably noticed details I took for granted. Daniel remained seated, but his posture had relaxed considerably. You're doing the right thing, Mom. Grandma Dorothy would want her things to be properly cared for and appreciated. I wasn't so sure about that. Mother had been fiercely protective of her jewelry, particular about who touched it and how it was handled. She'd told me stories about each piece, about the occasions when they were given, and the memories they held. But she'd never mentioned anything about having them appraised or valued by strangers. The front door opened again, and Meredith returned with a woman who looked to be in her early 40s. Rebecca was professionally dressed in a black blazer and slacks, carrying a small leather briefcase, and wearing the kind of serious expression that was meant to inspire confidence. Her handshake was firm, her smile practiced. Mrs. Holbrook, thank you so much for allowing me to see your mother's collection. Meredith has told me wonderful things about the pieces. I specialize in estate jewelry from the mid-20th century, And I understand your mother had quite an eye for quality. Again, I wondered what exactly Meredith had told her, and how she'd come to know so much about Mother's taste in jewelry. But Rebecca seemed professional enough, and Daniel was right. It wouldn't hurt to understand what I was dealing with. We made our way upstairs to Mother's bedroom, a room I'd barely entered since her death. Everything remained exactly as she'd left it. The hand-crocheted doily on the nightstand, the stack of romance novels she'd never finished, the small dish where she kept her reading glasses. The jewelry box sat on the dresser like a sentinel, its dark wood gleaming in the afternoon light that filtered through the sheer curtains. Rebecca approached it with the reverence of someone who understood she was in the presence of history. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the box. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing the organized chaos of a lifetime's collection. Rings nested in their designated slots, necklaces hung from tiny hooks, earrings paired carefully in their cushioned compartments. The afternoon light caught the gems and metals, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the mirror inside the lid. Rebecca's intake of breath was audible. "Oh my," she whispered. "These are absolutely exquisite." She began to examine pieces one by one, holding them up to the light, checking clasps and settings with a practiced eye. Daniel and Meredith watched from the doorway, and I found myself studying their faces. Daniel looked pleased, satisfied with his decision to arrange this meeting. Meredith's expression was harder to read. There was interest there, certainly, but something else too. Something that made me think of a cat watching a canary. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "This diamond brooch," Rebecca said, holding up a piece I remembered Mother wearing to church every Easter. "Art Deco period, probably 1920s. Excellent condition. And these pearl earrings, are these cultured or natural?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "They were a gift from my father to my mother on their wedding day." Rebecca nodded knowingly. Natural pearls of this size and quality would be quite valuable. And this? She lifted a delicate gold bracelet set with small emeralds. "This is stunning craftsmanship. Do you know where it came from?" I did know. Mother had bought it for herself with her first paycheck from her job at the telephone company, back when women weren't supposed to buy their own jewelry. She'd worn it as a symbol of independence, a reminder that she could provide beautiful things for herself. But something made me hesitate to share that story with this stranger. It was one of her favorites, I said. Instead, Rebecca continued her examination for another 20 minutes, making soft sounds of appreciation and occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. When she finally closed the jewelry box, her expression was serious but pleased. "Mrs. Holbrook, your mother had impeccable taste. This collection represents not just monetary value, but historical significance. Some of these pieces are museum quality." Daniel stepped closer. "What kind of monetary value are we talking about?" Rebecca glanced at me, then back at Daniel. "A proper appraisal would take more time and require better lighting, but conservatively, I'd estimate the collection at somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000, possibly more depending on provenance and certification of the stones." The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known Mother's jewelry was nice, but I'd never imagined it was worth more than a new car. Suddenly, the attention from Daniel and Meredith made more sense, and I felt naive for not seeing it sooner. "Of course," Rebecca continued, "the market for estate jewelry can be tricky. Pieces like this often do better at specialized auctions rather than general estate sales. With the right presentation and marketing, you could potentially see even higher returns." "Mom's not looking to sell," Daniel said quickly, but there was something in his voice that made me look at him more closely. "Of course not," Rebecca agreed smoothly. "I'm just providing information for insurance purposes. As Meredith mentioned, though I will say, if you ever did decide to sell any pieces, I'd be honored to help facilitate that process. I have clients who specifically collect jewelry from this era." As we made our way back downstairs, my mind was spinning. The house suddenly felt different, as if knowing the true value of mother's jewelry had somehow changed the very air inside it. I found myself thinking about security, about insurance, about things I'd never had to consider before. "Thank you so much for your time, Rebecca," I said as we reached the front door. "This has been very enlightening." She handed me a business card, her smile warm but professional. "Please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions or if you decide you'd like a formal appraisal." "And Mrs. Holbrook? Your mother clearly loved beautiful things. Whatever you decide to do with the collection, I'm sure she'd be proud knowing they're in such caring hands." After Rebecca left, Daniel and Meredith lingered for a few more minutes. Meredith complimented my coffee and asked about my garden, but I could sense their restlessness, their eagerness to discuss what they'd just witnessed. When they finally said their goodbyes, I watched from the window as they sat in their car for several minutes before driving away, heads bent together in animated conversation. That evening, I found myself back in Mother's room, staring at the jewelry box. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I opened the lid again and looked at the pieces Rebecca had examined, trying to see them through her eyes. Were they really worth so much money? Has Mother known their value? I thought about the stories Mother had told me about each piece, the memories and emotions they represented. None of those stories had ever mentioned dollar signs or investment potential. They were about love, about marking important moments, about treating herself to something beautiful during difficult times. When had I stopped thinking about them that way? The sound of my phone buzzing downstairs interrupted my thoughts. By the time I made it to the kitchen, I'd missed the call, but there was a voicemail waiting. Daniel's voice filled the quiet house. "Hey Mom, I just wanted to follow up today. Meredith and I were talking, and we think it might be a good idea to get that formal appraisal Rebecca mentioned. You know, for insurance purposes. Give me a call back when you get this. Love you." I set the phone down and stared out the kitchen window at the maple trees, their leaves now fully turned to brilliant shades of orange and red. Change was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. I just wasn't sure yet what kind of change it would be, or whether I'd recognize my life when it was over. That night, I dreamed of Mother's hands, placing each piece of jewelry carefully in its designated spot, her fingers gentle and sure. In the dream, she looked at me with worry in her eyes, and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. When I woke up, I found myself wishing I'd listened more carefully to what she'd been trying to tell me. 3 days after Rebecca's visit, I was organizing Mother's old recipe box when the doorbell rang. The morning had been spent sorting through index cards covered in her careful handwriting. Instructions for apple cobbler, notes about adding extra vanilla to sugar cookies, reminders about timing for her famous pot roast. Each card was a small piece of her voice, and I'd been lost in the comfort of routine domestic wisdom when the sharp sound of the bell cut through my reverie. Through the peephole, I saw a uniformed delivery man, holding a large manila envelope. I signed for it without thinking much about it. Probably something from the lawyer's office about Mother's estate, which was still being finalized, despite the months that had passed. The legal system moved slowly, especially when dealing with someone who had lived in the same house for 47 years and accumulated a lifetime's worth of documentation. But when I tore open the envelope, the letterhead wasn't from Peterson, Adams and Associates. It was from something called Midwest Premium Insurance Services, and the letter inside made my hands shake as I read it. "Dear Mrs. Holbrook," it began in crisp, professional language. "We are writing to inform you that a claim has been filed against policy number 847293, HB regarding valuable personal property at your residence. As per the terms of your coverage, we require immediate documentation and professional appraisal of all items listed in the attached inventory. Please contact our office within 72 hours to schedule an inspection." I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. Policy number? Claim? What claim? I hadn't filed any insurance claim. I hadn't even updated my homeowner's insurance since Mother died. It was one of those tasks sitting on my ever-growing list of things I needed to address, but kept putting off. The attached inventory made my blood run cold. It was a typed list of Mother's jewelry, described in professional terms that stripped away all their personal meaning. One platinum and diamond brooch, Art Deco period, approximately 2.5 carats. One strand of natural pearl necklace, graduated, approximately 18 inches. One gold charm bracelet, 14K with multiple vintage charms. The descriptions were precise, detailed, and absolutely accurate, more accurate than I could have provided myself. Someone had not only cataloged Mother's entire collection, but had also provided estimated values and identifying characteristics that could only have come from close examination, the kind of examination Rebecca had performed in Mother's bedroom 3 days ago. At the bottom of the inventory, in smaller print, was a note that made my stomach drop. Claim filed by authorized representative Daniel M. Holbrook, son of insured, regarding potential theft of high-value items from residents. My own son had filed an insurance claim about Mother's jewelry being stolen from my house. Without telling me, the implication hung in the air like smoke. Either Daniel genuinely believed the jewelry had been stolen, which was impossible since I'd just seen it all 3 days ago, or he was trying to collect insurance money on items that were still safely in Mother's bedroom. I dropped into the kitchen chair, the letter trembling in my hands. This wasn't possible. Daniel wouldn't do something like this. There had to be an explanation. A misunderstanding. Maybe someone had stolen his identity, used his name fraudulently. Maybe the insurance company had made an error, confusing one case with another. But even as I tried to rationalize it, pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Rebecca's visit hadn't been about insurance appraisal at all. It had been about cataloging items for a fraudulent claim. The detailed descriptions, the professional language, the precise valuations. It all made sense now, and Meredith's knowledge about the jewelry, her casual comments about pieces from the 1940s and 50s being valuable. She hadn't been making conversation. She'd been gathering intelligence. My phone was ringing. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I just stared at it, unsure whether I wanted to answer or throw the phone across the room. On the fourth ring, I picked up. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing today?" His voice was cheerful, casual, the same tone he'd used since childhood when he was about to ask for something he knew I might refuse. "Daniel, I need to ask you about something." I tried to keep my voice steady, to give him a chance to explain. "I just received a letter from an insurance company about a claim. Did you file an insurance claim about Mother's jewelry?" The pause was just a half-second too long. "Oh, that, yeah, I was going to talk to you about that. It's just a precaution, Mom. After what Rebecca told us about the value of those pieces. Meredith and I got worried about security. What if something happened? What if someone broke in? You're living alone in that big house, and everyone in town knows Grandma Dorothy had nice things." His explanation sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it. "But Daniel, the claim says the jewelry was stolen." "It's not stolen. It's still here, in Mother's room." "Right, but the insurance company needs documentation before anything actually happens. It's like preventive filing. That way if something does happen, you're already in the system. The whole process goes much faster." I'd never heard of preventive filing for theft claims, and something in Daniel's tone suggested he was making it up as he went along. "I don't understand. Why didn't you discuss this with me first?" "It's my house, my insurance. We didn't want to worry you with all the paperwork and details. You've been dealing with so much since Grandma died. We just wanted to handle it for you, make sure you were protected." The concern in his voice would have been touching if it hadn't come attached to a fraudulent insurance claim filed without my knowledge or consent. I found myself thinking about the young man who used to confess his mistakes before I even discovered them, who once walked 2 miles in the rain to return a candy bar he'd accidentally taken from a store. When had that honesty disappeared? "Daniel, I need you to cancel this claim immediately. I don't want to file for theft on jewelry that hasn't been stolen." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming more careful, more calculated. "Mom, I think you're misunderstanding how insurance works. This isn't about filing a false claim, it's about establishing value and coverage." Rebecca's assessment was professional and accurate. The jewelry is worth more than your current policy covers. If something happens and you're not properly insured, you could lose everything. But the claim specifically mentions theft. It says the items were stolen. That's just insurance language, Mom. They have categories they have to use. The important thing is that you're protected. I could hear Meredith's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Daniel covered the phone for a moment, then came back on the line. Look, why don't we come over this evening and go through everything together? We can call the insurance company and get all the details straightened out. But Mom, please don't do anything until we talk. Okay? These kinds of policies can be complicated, and if you cancel something incorrectly, it could affect your coverage for everything. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the insurance letter. The afternoon light, that had seemed so warm and comforting when I was reading Mother's recipes, now felt harsh and exposing. I walked upstairs to Mother's room and opened the jewelry box again. Everything was there. Exactly as it had been 3 days ago. Exactly as Mother had left it 6 months ago. But now these pieces felt different, tainted somehow by their transformation into line items on an insurance inventory. The pearl necklace wasn't a symbol of love for my father anymore. It was one strand of natural pearls, graduated, estimated value $3,020. The charm bracelet that had marked decades of family milestones was now $14K gold charm bracelet with vintage charms. Estimated value $1,000. I thought about calling the insurance company directly, but Daniel's warning about not canceling anything incorrectly gave me pause. What if I made things worse? What if there were legal implications I didn't understand? I'd always relied on Daniel for help with complicated financial matters. He worked in sales, understood contracts and policies in ways I didn't, but now that dependence feels dangerous. Instead, I called my neighbor Margaret Chen, who lived 2 houses down and had become something of a friend since Mother's death. Margaret had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring, and she had a practical approach to problems that I'd come to value. Patricia? You sound upset. What's wrong? I explained about the insurance letter, about Daniel's claim, about the confusing explanation he'd given me. Margaret listened without interrupting, making occasional sounds that indicated she was taking notes. Honey, she said when I finished, I've never heard of preventive filing for theft claims. That's not how insurance works. You file a claim after something happens, not before. And you said the jewelry is still there? Yes, I'm looking at it right now. Then this sounds like attempted insurance fraud to me. The question is whether your son knows it's fraud, or whether someone has convinced him this is legitimate. The word fraud hit me like cold water. I'd been dancing around it in my mind, but hearing Margaret say it out loud made it real. What should I do? First, don't sign anything or agree to anything until you understand exactly what's happening. Second, call that insurance company yourself and find out what this claim actually says. Get the details directly from them, not filtered through Daniel or his wife. And Patricia, you might want to think about getting some independent advice. A lawyer, maybe, or at least someone who understands insurance law. After we hung up, I found myself pacing through the house, unable to settle. Every room held memories of Daniel growing up. The living room where he'd built elaborate towers with blocks, the kitchen where he'd done homework at the counter while I cooked dinner, the back porch where he'd practiced baseball pitches against the garage door until the neighbors complained. How had that little boy become someone who would file false insurance claims using his mother's name? The mail truck arrived in the late afternoon, and along with the usual bills and advertisements was another envelope that made my heart sink. This one was from Elmwood Mutual Bank, where I'd kept my accounts for over 20 years. The letter inside was brief and formal. We have received a request for account information related to policy claim 81293. HB filed with Midwest Premium Insurance Services. As per standard procedure in potential fraud investigations, we are required to notify account holders of such inquiries. Fraud investigations. The bank was treating this as a potential fraud case, which meant the insurance company was taking it seriously enough to investigate financial records. My financial records. Without my permission or knowledge, I called the bank immediately, speaking to a customer service representative who sounded like she was reading from a script. Yes, they had received a request for information. No, they couldn't tell me exactly what information was requested without proper authorization. Yes, I could come in and speak to a manager if I wanted more details. The earliest appointment available was the next morning. I hung up feeling like I was trapped in some kind of bureaucratic maze where everyone knew what was happening except me. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I snooped. While I waited for Daniel and Meredith to arrive, I went through the house looking for anything that might give me clues about what was really happening. In the small office off the living room where I kept important papers, I found my homeowner's insurance policy. The coverage for personal property was indeed lower than what Rebecca had estimated for Mother's jewelry. But it wasn't dramatically lower, certainly not enough to justify filing a fraudulent claim. But tucked behind the insurance folder was something that made my blood run cold. A photocopy of Mother's death certificate, and a handwritten note in what looked like Meredith's writing. The note listed several pieces of jewelry with brief descriptions and the words "confirm availability" written beside each one. The implications were staggering. They hadn't just planned to file an insurance claim, they'd been planning it since Mother's death, maybe even before. The note was dated just 2 weeks after the funeral, when I was still barely functional with grief, when I couldn't imagine sorting through her belongings, let alone cataloging them for potential theft. When Daniel and Meredith arrived that evening, I was ready for them in a way I hadn't been that morning. I'd spent the afternoon thinking, planning, and preparing. I'd also done one more thing. I'd called my nephew James, Mother's grandson from her first marriage, and asked him to come over. James was a police officer in the next county, and while I hadn't told him why I needed him there, I'd asked him to arrive about 30 minutes after Daniel and Meredith were scheduled to come. The evening air was crisp as autumn settled deeper into Michigan. Daniel and Meredith arrived precisely on time, and I noticed they both looked more formal than usual. Daniel wore a suit instead of his typical casual clothes, and Meredith carried a leather portfolio that suggested they'd come prepared for serious business. "Mom, you look worried," Daniel said as I let them in. "I hope our phone conversation today didn't upset you. This insurance thing really is routine. We're just trying to protect you." I led them into the living room and gestured for them to sit. Instead of joining them, I remained standing, the insurance letter and the bank notification in my hands. "Daniel, I need you to be completely honest with me. This claim you filed, it states that Mother's jewelry was stolen, not that it might be stolen, not that we need to establish coverage. It says it was stolen. That's insurance fraud if the items weren't actually stolen, isn't it?" Meredith opened her portfolio and pulled out several documents. "Patricia, I think there's been a misunderstanding. What we filed was a preliminary assessment request. It's a new type of policy that allows you to establish pre-claim documentation for high-value items. The language might sound like a theft claim, but it's actually quite different." She handed me a brochure for something called Heritage Protection Coverage, which looked official and professional. But as I read through it, I noticed that the company name was slightly different from the one on the insurance letter I'd received. Subtle differences: Midwest Premium Insurance versus Midwest Premier Insurance Services. But different enough to suggest deception. "This isn't the same company that sent me the claim notice," I said, holding up both documents. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there are multiple companies involved in these kinds of specialized policies. It's complicated, Mom. That's why we wanted to handle it for you." The doorbell rang, and through the window I could see James's police cruiser in the driveway. Daniel and Meredith exchanged glances, and I saw something flicker across Meredith's face that looked very much like panic. "I asked my nephew to stop by," I said simply. "I thought it might be helpful to have someone here who understands legal matters." When James walked in, still in uniform from his shift, the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. He was a big man, quiet and observant, with the kind of presence that made people choose their words more carefully. "Evening, folks," he said, nodding to Daniel and Meredith before giving me a brief hug. "Aunt Patricia said you were having some questions about insurance paperwork." I handed him the letter from Midwest Premium Insurance, watching Daniel's face as James read it. My son had gone very pale, and Meredith was gathering her documents with movements that seemed a little too quick, a little too nervous. James looked up from the letter, his expression serious. "This is a theft claim, filed 3 days ago. It says stolen jewelry valued at approximately $90,000. He looked at me. "Aunt Patricia, was your mother's jewelry stolen?" "No," I said firmly. "It's all still here in her bedroom. Exactly where it's been since she died." James looked at Daniel. "Did you file this claim?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Meredith reached for his hand, and I saw her squeeze it in what might have been warning or encouragement. "There's been a misunderstanding," Daniel said finally. "This isn't what it looks like." James folded the letter carefully and handed it back to me. "Maybe we should go take a look at this jewelry collection, make sure everything's accounted for. If nothing's missing, then this claim needs to be withdrawn immediately. Filing false insurance claims is a felony." The word felony hung in the air like smoke. Meredith stood abruptly, her portfolio clutched against her chest. "Actually, we should probably head home," she said, her voice tight. "This has obviously become more complicated than we anticipated. Daniel, we should let your mother handle this however she thinks is best." But Daniel didn't move. He sat there looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part guilt, part calculation, part something that might have been genuine regret. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Daniel's words, "I think we need to talk," hung in the air while Meredith stood frozen by the doorway, her knuckles white where they gripped her leather portfolio. James remained perfectly still, his police training evident in the way he positioned himself to observe everyone in the room, without appearing threatening. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think we do need to talk." Meredith cleared her throat. "Maybe this conversation should happen privately, between family. Officer." She looked at James uncertainly. "Detective Chen," James supplied smoothly. "And I'm family too. Patricia is my aunt." Daniel finally stood, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught in lies about homework or missed curfews. "Mom, this whole thing got out of hand. We never meant for it to go this far." "How far was it supposed to go?" "Exactly." I kept my voice level, though my heart was pounding. Daniel glanced at Meredith, who gave him an almost imperceptible shake of her head. "We were going to tell you, before anything actually happened with the insurance company. We just needed to understand our options." James pulled out a small notebook, the kind police officers carry. "Your options for what?" Meredith stepped forward, her composure returning. "Detective Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of this insurance inquiry. What we filed was a preliminary assessment for estate planning purposes. Sometimes the language on these forms can be confusing to people who aren't familiar with insurance terminology." "Estate planning," I repeated slowly. "Estate planning for jewelry that belongs to me, in my house that I'm still living to enjoy." Daniel flinched. "Mom, that's not. We weren't trying to plan around your death. We were trying to plan for your protection. By filing a claim, stating the jewelry was stolen, when it wasn't. By establishing a paper trail that would protect you if something did happen." Meredith interjected. "These pieces are extremely valuable, Patricia, more valuable than you realized. If someone broke in, if there was a fire, if anything happened to them, you'd be devastated. Not just emotionally but financially." James looked up from his notebook. "Ma'am, establishing protection typically involves updating insurance coverage or getting additional riders for high-value items. It doesn't involve filing claims for thefts that didn't occur." The doorbell rang again, startling everyone. Through the window, I could see a car I didn't recognize. A dark sedan with a man in a suit standing on my front porch. He held an official-looking envelope in his hand. "Are you expecting someone else?" Daniel asked, and I caught a note of panic in his voice. I wasn't, but I answered the door anyway. The man introduced himself as Frank Morrison from the State Insurance Fraud Investigation Unit. He handed me the envelope with polite efficiency. Mrs. Holbrook, we've received a complaint about irregularities in a claim filed under your homeowner's policy. We'll need to schedule an interview to discuss the circumstances surrounding the reported theft of jewelry from your residence. Behind me, I heard Meredith whisper something to Daniel that sounded like "I told you this would happen." There was no theft, I told Mr. Morrison. The jewelry is still here. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. Morrison nodded as if he'd heard this before. That's exactly what we need to discuss, ma'am. The complaint indicates possible fraud, but we need to verify the facts. Would tomorrow morning at 10 be convenient? After he left, the living room felt smaller, the air thicker. James closed his notebook and looked directly at Daniel. You need to withdraw that claim immediately. Tonight, before this gets worse. Daniel sank back into the sofa, his head in his hands. It's not that simple. There are other people involved now. What other people? I demanded. Meredith shot Daniel a warning look, but he was past caring about her signals. Rebecca isn't just an estate jewelry appraiser. She works with investors, people who specialize in acquiring valuable estate pieces. The pieces click together with horrible clarity. You sold Mother's jewelry to her. No, Daniel looked up quickly. We didn't sell anything. But we promised her first option if you ever decided to sell. She paid us a consultation fee for the assessment. How much of a consultation fee? Daniel couldn't meet my eyes. $5,000. James whistled low. You took money from someone for the right to buy jewelry that doesn't belong to you. It was going to belong to Daniel eventually, Meredith said defensively. As Patricia's heir, we were just managing the transition more efficiently. The casual way she discussed my death, as if it were a business transaction waiting to happen, sent a chill through me. I haven't made any decisions about who inherits what when I die. And I certainly haven't decided to die anytime soon. Of course not, Meredith said quickly. But estate planning requires thinking ahead, being practical about these things. Being practical, I repeated. Is that what you call taking money from strangers for jewelry you don't own, then filing false insurance claims to cover your tracks? Daniel looked up at me with an expression that reminded me painfully of the 8-year-old who'd once confessed to breaking my favorite vase. Mom, we needed the money. My commissions have been down for 6 months. Meredith's been out of work since her company downsized. We're behind on our mortgage, behind on everything. When Rebecca offered us that consultation fee, it felt like a lifeline. So you decided to throw me overboard to grab it. We weren't going to hurt you, Daniel insisted. The plan was to use the insurance money to pay Rebecca back, then tell you the jewelry had been recovered. You'd never have known the difference. James looked at Daniel with the kind of professional disappointment I'd seen him use on suspects. Except, that's insurance fraud. Mail fraud, and possibly theft by deception. You're looking at felony charges here. Meredith's composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous. Nothing was actually stolen. No one was actually hurt. It was just paperwork. Paperwork that you used to obtain $5,000 fraudulently, James pointed out. Paperwork that triggered a state investigation. Paperwork that could have resulted in Patricia's insurance being canceled if she'd been found to be filing false claims. I sank into my chair, feeling suddenly very old. How long have you been planning this? Daniel and Meredith exchanged glances again. It was Meredith who answered. Since the funeral. When we saw the jewelry at the memorial service, we realized how valuable it was. We started researching options. While I was grieving my mother, you were researching how to profit from her jewelry. We were researching how to help you manage valuable assets, Meredith corrected, but her voice lacked conviction. James stood up. I'm going to need you both to come to the station tomorrow for formal statements, and I strongly recommend you contact the insurance company tonight to withdraw that claim. If they process payment before you withdraw it, this becomes a much more serious crime. After James left, Daniel and Meredith sat in my living room like children waiting for punishment. The autumn darkness had settled outside, and the lamps cast harsh shadows across their faces. Mom, Daniel said finally, we'll fix this. We'll withdraw the claim, pay Rebecca back somehow. We never meant for it to get this complicated. What you meant, I said quietly, was to steal from me without me knowing it. We didn't think of it as stealing. You don't even wear those pieces. They just sit in Grandma's room collecting dust. They sit there, holding memories. They sit there, representing a lifetime of love and celebration and marking important moments. They sit there, waiting for me to decide when and how to honor what they mean. Meredith leaned forward. Patricia, we understand they have sentimental value, but they also have monetary value that could benefit the whole family. If something happened to you tomorrow, Daniel would inherit them anyway. We were just trying to access that value while it could help solve our current problems. And if I lived for another 20 years, if I decided to sell them myself and use the money for my own needs, if I decided to leave them to someone else entirely, the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't considered any of those possibilities because they'd already decided my life was essentially over, that my role was to be a placeholder until they could claim their inheritance. I want you both to leave now, I said. I need time to think about all of this. Daniel stood slowly. Mom, please don't make any decisions tonight. Let us figure out how to fix this first. The time for you to fix this was before you betrayed me. Now I need to decide how to protect myself from my own family. After they left, I walked through my house, turning on every light, as if brightness could chase away the darkness they'd brought into my home. I ended up in Mother's room, sitting on the edge of her bed, looking at the jewelry box that had started all of this trouble. The pieces inside weren't just valuable objects. They were the physical manifestations of a life well lived, of love given and received, of milestones celebrated and sorrows endured. Daniel and Meredith saw them as commodities to be liquidated. But they were so much more than that. They were also, I realized, the key to understanding just how far my son and his wife were willing to go to get what they wanted. And tomorrow, when the insurance investigator arrived, I would have to decide how far I was willing to go to stop them. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face when he admitted taking money from Rebecca, and heard Meredith's casual discussion of my eventual death as if it were an item on a business agenda. By 5 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely, and made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the sky gradually lighten over the lake. The insurance investigator, Frank Morrison, arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of methodical manner that suggested he'd handled plenty of cases like this one. He declined my offer of coffee and set up a small recording device on my kitchen table with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Holbrook, I need to understand the timeline of events leading up to this insurance claim. Let's start with when you first became aware that valuable jewelry was in your possession. I explained about Mother's death 6 months ago, about the jewelry box I'd been unable to sort through, about my assumption that the pieces were nice but not extraordinarily valuable. Morrison took notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or details. And when did you first learn about the actual value of these items? 3 days ago, when my son brought an appraiser to the house, a woman named Rebecca who said the collection was worth between $80,000 and $120,000. Morrison's pen stopped moving. Your son arranged this appraisal? Yes. He said it was for insurance purposes, to make sure the jewelry was properly covered. But you didn't request this appraisal yourself? No. I had no idea the pieces were valuable enough to need special coverage. Morrison asked to see the jewelry, and I led him upstairs to Mother's room. He examined the collection with professional detachment, taking photographs and making notes about specific pieces. Unlike Rebecca, he handled each item with clinical precision, clearly documenting their presence and condition. Mrs. Holbrook, these items are definitely here in your possession and appear to be secure. The insurance claim filed by your son states they were stolen 3 days ago. Can you think of any reason why he would report them as stolen when they clearly weren't? Before I could answer, we heard voices downstairs. Daniel's voice, raised and agitated, calling my name. Morrison and I exchanged glances and he quietly gathered his camera and notes. "Let's go see what this is about," he said calmly. Downstairs, I found Daniel pacing in my kitchen, Meredith standing rigidly by the back door. They both looked like they hadn't slept, and there was a desperate energy radiating from them that made me take a step back. "Mom, we need to talk before you say anything else to anyone," Daniel said rapidly. "This whole situation can still be resolved quietly if we handle it right." Morrison stepped into view behind me. "Mr. Holbrook, I presume?" "I'm Frank Morrison from the State Insurance Fraud Investigation Unit. I believe we need to have a conversation." The color drained from Daniel's face. "You called the state?" "I didn't call anyone," I said. "Apparently filing false insurance claims triggers automatic investigations." Meredith stepped forward, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Mr. Morrison, there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of that claim. We're prepared to withdraw it immediately and resolve this matter privately." Morrison sat down at my kitchen table and gestured for them to join him. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. Once a claim is filed and an investigation begins, we have to follow it through to completion, but I'd be very interested to hear your explanation for why you reported stolen jewelry that's clearly still in Mrs. Holbrook's possession." Daniel slumped into a chair, his hands shaking. "We needed money. We're going to lose our house. Meredith lost her job 8 months ago. My commissions have been cut in half, and we're drowning. When we saw how valuable Mom's jewelry was, we thought maybe we could borrow against it somehow." "Borrow against it? How?" Meredith answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca offered to buy the pieces for fair market value, but she needed documentation for her insurance. She suggested we file a theft claim, then recover the pieces and sell them to her. The insurance money would cover our debts, and Mom would still get the full value of the jewelry." Morrison looked up from his notes. "Except that plan involves multiple felonies. Insurance fraud, filing false police reports, conspiracy to commit fraud. But no one was supposed to get hurt," Daniel protested. "Mom would have gotten the same amount of money either way. The same amount of money for jewelry that belongs to her and that she never agreed to sell." Morrison pointed out, "Did you ask Mrs. Holbrook if she wanted to liquidate her mother's jewelry to solve your financial problems?" The silence stretched long enough to answer the question. I found my voice finally, though it came out harder than I'd intended. "Not only did you not ask me, you actively deceived me. You brought that appraiser here under false pretenses, filed fraudulent claims using my name, and took money from someone for the right to sell property that isn't yours. You treated me like I was already dead." Daniel looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, we never meant for it to feel like that. We love you. We didn't know what else to do. You could have asked for help. You could have told me you were in financial trouble. You could have treated me like a human being instead of an obstacle to your inheritance." Meredith's composure finally shattered completely. "We couldn't ask you for help because you don't have any money to give. You live on Social Security and Dad's pension. You clip coupons and shop at thrift stores. We didn't think you could understand what it's like to face losing everything. So you decided to steal from me instead. We decided to access assets that were just sitting there doing nothing." Meredith's voice rose to nearly a shout. "Those pieces don't mean anything to you. You never wear them, never even look at them. They're just taking up space in a dead woman's room while we're about to lose our home." The cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Morrison's expression had gone very cold, and I saw him make a note that underlined something several times. Daniel reached across the table toward me. "Mom, please." "Meredith's upset. She didn't mean that the way it sounded." "I meant exactly what I said," Meredith snapped. "Patricia, you're 64 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you, surrounded by possessions from people who are dead. Meanwhile, your son is facing bankruptcy because you're hoarding valuable assets that could solve real, immediate problems." "Those assets," I said quietly, "belong to me. They represent my mother's life, my family's history, my own security for whatever years I have left. They are not your emergency fund." Morrison cleared his throat. I think we need to address the immediate legal issues here. Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook, you've admitted to filing a fraudulent insurance claim with the intent to collect money for items that were never stolen. You've also admitted to receiving payment from a third party in exchange for access to property that doesn't belong to you. These are serious crimes. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What happens now? That depends partly on Mrs. Holbrook. As the victim of the fraud, she has some input into how we proceed. But given the dollar amounts involved, and the premeditated nature of the scheme, charges will likely be filed regardless. I felt the weight of that decision settling on my shoulders. Daniel was my son, the little boy I'd rocked to sleep, the teenager I'd worried about, the young man I'd celebrated when he graduated college and started his career. But he was also someone who had betrayed me in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. I need time to think about this, I said. Meredith leaned forward desperately. Patricia, please. If Daniel gets a criminal record, he'll lose his job. We'll lose everything anyway, and it won't help anyone. You were willing to risk my criminal record when you filed that claim in my name, I pointed out. Did you think about me losing everything when you forged my signature on those documents? Daniel's head snapped up. We didn't forge your signature. Morrison consulted his notes. The claim form shows Patricia Holbrook as the filer, with a signature that presumably matches her identification. I never signed anything, I said firmly. Morrison looked at Daniel and Meredith with renewed interest. Who signed the claim form? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Meredith spoke in a voice so low I could barely hear her. I did. I signed Patricia's name. With her permission. No. Morrison made another note, this one longer. That's identity theft and forgery in addition to the fraud charges. The room felt like it was spinning. Not only had they betrayed me, they had committed crimes using my identity that could have resulted in me being charged with fraud myself. If I hadn't received that letter, if I hadn't questioned the claim, I could have found myself under investigation for crimes I didn't commit. Daniel seemed to realize this at the same time I did. Mom, God, we never thought about you getting in trouble. We thought if anything went wrong, we'd just tell them it was a mistake. A mistake? I repeated numbly. You thought forgery and fraud were mistakes you could just explain away. Morrison stood up. I think we've covered enough ground for today. Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook, I'll need you to come to my office tomorrow morning for formal statements. Mrs. Holbrook, I'll need you to come in as well to provide your statement as the victim. After Morrison left, Daniel and Meredith sat in my kitchen like condemned prisoners awaiting sentencing. The autumn sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting the lines of stress and fear on their faces. Mom, Daniel said quietly, I know we've messed this up beyond belief. But please, when you talk to Morrison tomorrow, remember that we're family. Remember that I'm your son. I looked at this man who shared my blood, who had my eyes and his father's stubborn chin, who had once been the center of my world. And I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the center of his. I'll remember that you're my son, I said finally. But I'll also remember that my son was willing to steal from me, lie to me, and use my identity to commit crimes. Those are things I never thought I'd have to remember about you. That evening, after they left, I sat in Mother's room surrounded by the jewelry that had caused so much trouble. Each piece gleamed in the lamplight, beautiful and valuable, and completely unchanged by the greed they had inspired. I thought about the stories Mother had told me about each one, the love and celebration they represented, the careful way she had chosen and cared for them. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to press charges against my own son. Tonight I just sat with my mother's treasures and tried to figure out how to live with the knowledge that the family I thought I had was largely an illusion, built on assumptions about love and loyalty that had crumbled the moment money became involved. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the realization that Daniel and Meredith genuinely seemed to believe they had done nothing truly wrong. In their minds, they were the victims of circumstance, forced into desperate measures by financial pressure. They saw me not as a person with my own rights and needs, but as an obstacle to resources they felt entitled to claim. That night, for the first time since Mother's death, I cried. Not for her, but for the son I thought I had raised, and for the mother I had apparently failed to be. I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The crying had helped, washing away the shock and disbelief that had clouded my thinking since this nightmare began. What remained was a cold, sharp understanding of exactly what had happened and what I needed to do about it. After making coffee, I did something I should have done days ago. I called my lawyer, Harold Peterson, who had handled Mother's estate and had been the family attorney for over 20 years. Even at 7 in the morning, he answered on the second ring. "Patricia? Is everything all right? You sound upset." I explained the situation methodically, reading him portions of the insurance documents, describing the confession I'd witnessed yesterday. Harold listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds that suggested he was taking notes. "Patricia, this is much worse than simple fraud. By using your identity and forging your signature, they've potentially exposed you to criminal liability. If this investigation had proceeded without your knowledge, you could have been arrested." The weight of that statement settled over me like a cold blanket. "Harold, I need to understand all my options, not just legally, but practically. What can I do to protect myself? First, we need to document everything. I want copies of all the insurance paperwork, records of any money that changed hands, and a complete inventory of the jewelry they targeted. Second, we need to consider whether there are other vulnerabilities they might have created, credit cards opened in your name, loans against your property, anything like that. I hadn't even thought about other potential fraud. How would I find out about things like that? Credit reports, bank statements, property records. We'll do a complete financial audit to make sure this jewelry scheme wasn't just the tip of the iceberg." After hanging up with Harold, I spent the next hour going through my financial records with a fine-tooth comb. Bank statements, credit card bills, investment accounts. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I found something that made my blood run cold. In my checking account statement from 2 months ago, there was an electronic withdrawal for $2,800 that I didn't remember authorizing. The transaction was labeled Estate Planning Services, Holbrook Family Trust. I had never established a family trust, and I certainly hadn't authorized anyone to withdraw money for one. I called the bank immediately. After being transferred through 3 different departments, I finally reached someone who could access the transaction details. The withdrawal had been authorized using my online banking credentials, initiated from a computer that wasn't mine, for services I'd never requested. "Ma'am, do you have your online banking information written down anywhere, or saved on a computer that others might have access to?" I thought about the small office where I kept my important papers, the desk where I sometimes let Daniel use my computer when he visited. "Yes, it's possible someone could have accessed my information. I'm flagging your account for potential fraud and initiating a trace on that transaction. We'll also need to change all your passwords and security questions immediately." After ending that call, I sat staring at the bank statement. $2,800 was exactly what I typically spent in a month on groceries, utilities, and other living expenses. They had essentially stolen a month of my financial security, and I wondered what estate planning services had actually provided in return. The answer came when I called Harold back with this new information. He'd been busy making his own inquiries. "Patricia, I've discovered some very troubling things. There is indeed a Holbrook Family Trust that was established 2 months ago, with Daniel listed as the primary trustee and Meredith as secondary trustee. You're listed as the trust grantor, but the signature on the documents isn't yours." My hands began to shake. What does this trust do? It appears to be designed to bypass probate and give Daniel immediate control over your assets upon your death. But here's the really concerning part. It also includes provisions for managing your assets if you're deemed incapacitated. Incapacitated by whom? By a doctor of their choosing. Patricia, if you had ever needed medical care and they had convinced a doctor you were mentally unfit, they could have taken control of everything you own while you were still alive. The scope of their planning was breathtaking. This wasn't a desperate last-minute scheme born of financial pressure. This was a systematic, months-long effort to position themselves to take everything I owned, whether I was dead or merely inconvenient. Harold, I want that trust dissolved immediately. And I want to know what else they've done that I don't know about yet. We'll handle the trust, but Patricia, you need to understand that we're probably looking at a much larger criminal conspiracy than insurance fraud. What you've discovered suggests they've been planning to systematically strip you of your assets and legal autonomy. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. I drove to the electronics store in town and bought something I'd never thought I'd need, a small security camera system. The young man who sold it to me explained that the cameras were wireless, could record to a smartphone app, and would send instant notifications when they detected motion. Most people use these to keep an eye on their homes when they're away, he explained, as he rang up my purchase. But they're also good for monitoring specific rooms or valuable items. I didn't tell him that I needed to monitor my home when I was there, to protect myself from my own family. Installing the cameras took most of the evening, but by bedtime I had discrete devices positioned to monitor the front door, the living room, and most importantly, Mother's bedroom where the jewelry was kept. The app on my phone showed clear feeds from all 3 cameras, and I'd set it to record continuously and alert me to any motion when I wasn't home. That night, I did something else I'd never done before. I changed the locks on my house. Daniel had had a key since he was 18, but Daniel had also forged my signature and stolen money from my bank account. The man who installed the new deadbolts was a grandfather himself, and something in my face must have told him not to ask questions about why a 64-year-old woman needed new locks at 10 o'clock at night. "You've got a good solid door here," he said as he finished. "These locks won't stop someone who's really determined, but they'll definitely slow them down." Wednesday morning brought Frank Morrison back to my door, this time with a folder full of documents and a grim expression. We sat at my kitchen table again, but this time I felt more prepared, more in control. "Mrs. Holbrook, we've uncovered some additional irregularities that extend well beyond the insurance fraud. Are you aware that a trust was established in your name 2 months ago? I discovered that yesterday. My attorney is working to have it dissolved." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good. We've also traced the $5,000 payment your son received from Rebecca Williams. Turns out, Williams isn't just an estate jewelry appraiser. She's been under investigation for running a scheme where she identifies valuable estate pieces, then helps family members defraud insurance companies to obtain them. How many families has she done this to? You're the 4th case we know about. In the other 3, the elderly property owners died or were placed in nursing homes before the scheme was discovered. You're the first victim who's still competent and living independently. The implications of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Are you saying they expected me to die or become incapacitated?" Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. "I'm saying the timeline of their activities suggests they weren't planning for a long-term situation where you remained healthy and aware. I thought about the trust documents that would have given them control if I were deemed mentally unfit, about their casual discussions of my eventual death, about their complete shock when I started asking questions about the insurance claim. They hadn't planned for me to resist, because they hadn't planned for me to be around to resist. Mr. Morrison, I want to press full charges against both of them. Are you certain? Given that Daniel is your son, you might want to consider." "I'm certain. What they did to me, they've done to other families. If I don't hold them accountable, the next elderly person they target might not be as fortunate as I was." Morrison nodded and made a note in his file. "We'll proceed with charges for insurance fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. Given the organized nature of the scheme and the involvement of Rebecca Williams, we'll likely add RICO charges as well." That afternoon, Harold arrived with more disturbing news. His investigation had uncovered additional fraudulent activity I hadn't discovered yet. "Patricia, they've applied for credit cards in your name. 3 different cards, all maxed out, totaling about $18,000 in debt. They've also taken out a home equity line of credit against your house for $75,000. I felt like the floor was dropping out from under me. How is that possible? I never signed anything. They used the same forged signature technique they used on the insurance claim. And because they had access to your personal information and knew your banking details, they were able to provide enough verification to convince the lenders. Harold, they could have taken my house. They could have taken everything. The home equity line of credit puts your property at risk. If those credit cards had gone into default, if they'd missed payments on the equity line, you could have lost your home without ever knowing you were in debt. The scope of their betrayal was so vast, so systematic, that I found myself struggling to comprehend it. This wasn't desperation or poor judgment. This was a calculated effort to destroy my financial security and independence. What do we do now? We fight back. We dispute every fraudulent transaction, we freeze every account they've accessed, and we make sure they can never use your identity again. But Patricia, you need to understand that this process could take months or even years to fully resolve. That evening, I sat in Mother's room surrounded by the jewelry that had started this whole nightmare. But now I understood that the jewelry wasn't really the point. It was just the most visible symbol of everything they wanted to take from me: my security, my independence, my dignity, my right to control my own life and death. I thought about the trust they'd created without my knowledge, designed to strip away my autonomy the moment I showed any sign of vulnerability. I thought about the debts they'd accumulated in my name, the house they'd put at risk, the systematic way they'd planned to dismantle everything I'd worked to build and preserve. Most of all, I thought about other elderly people who might not have been as lucky as I was, who might not have questioned that insurance letter, who might have trusted their children right up until the moment they lost everything. My phone buzzed with a notification from the camera app. Someone was on my front porch. Through the app, I could see Daniel standing at my door, but he wasn't knocking. He was trying different keys in the lock, growing increasingly frustrated when none of them worked. I watched him for several minutes. This son I'd raised, this man I'd loved and supported and trusted, trying to break into my home after I'd discovered his betrayal. When he finally gave up and walked back to his car, I saw him make a phone call. Even through the grainy camera footage, I could see his agitation, his angry gestures. A few minutes later, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, but I didn't answer. He called 4 more times before finally leaving a voicemail. "Mom, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but you're making this harder than it needs to be. We can still work this out if you'll just listen to reason. Don't let the lawyers and police turn you against your own family." I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Harold and Frank Morrison. Even in defeat, Daniel was still trying to manipulate me, still trying to frame his crimes as reasonable responses to my unreasonable behavior. But I was done being reasonable with people who had never extended me the same courtesy. I was done protecting people who had spent months planning my financial destruction. I was done being the kind of mother who enabled her adult children to escape the consequences of their choices. Tomorrow I will begin the process of reclaiming my life and my security. Tonight I would sleep in my home with new locks and cameras protecting me, surrounded by my mother's jewelry and the knowledge that I was finally ready to fight for what was mine. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes everything seem possible. I woke up feeling more energized than I had in months. Possibly years. There's something liberating about finally understanding the full scope of a problem and knowing exactly what you need to do about it. My first call was to Harold, who had been working since dawn on my behalf. "Patricia, I have news. The credit card companies have agreed to treat the fraudulent accounts as identity theft and remove them from your credit report. The home equity line of credit is more complicated. We'll need to prove forgery in court, but I've managed to freeze it so no additional funds can be withdrawn." What about trust? That's where things get interesting. I've filed to have it dissolved, but in researching the paperwork, I discovered something Daniel and Meredith probably didn't expect us to find. The law firm that prepared the trust documents keeps detailed records of client meetings. According to their files, Meredith came in alone and told them you were suffering from early-stage dementia and that the family needed to prepare for your incapacitation. The betrayal kept finding new depths to shock me. They told strangers I had dementia, not just strangers, legal professionals who documented the conversation. She provided them with what she claimed was medical documentation supporting this diagnosis, though we now know those documents were fabricated. Harold, how many laws have they actually broken? At this point, identity theft, bank fraud, credit fraud, insurance fraud, forgery, conspiracy, filing false documents with a court, potentially mail fraud and wire fraud, since they used electronic and postal services to commit these crimes. If the federal authorities decide to get involved because of the interstate nature of some of these transactions, we could be looking at RICO charges. After ending that call, I made another one that felt equally important. I called my doctor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been my physician for over a decade. Patricia, it's good to hear from you. How are you doing since your mother's passing? Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. I need you to conduct a complete cognitive assessment and document my mental competency. It's for legal reasons. Dr. Martinez scheduled me for that afternoon, and I spent the morning preparing for what I suspected would be a very different kind of day than any I'd experienced before. At 11 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Meredith, and her voice had a quality I'd never heard before, desperate, but trying to hide it. Patricia, we need to talk. There are some misunderstandings that have gotten out of hand, and I think we can resolve them if we just sit down together like adults. Meredith, the time for talking was before you stole my identity and put my home at risk. I have nothing to say to you. Patricia, please listen to me. Daniel is beside himself with worry about you. He thinks you're not thinking clearly, that maybe the stress of losing your mother has affected your judgment. He's so concerned that he's been researching elder care options to make sure you're safe. The calculated cruelty of using my grief against me, combined with the threat of elder care, made my hands shake with anger. My judgment is perfectly clear, which is why I've hired an attorney and am pursuing criminal charges against both of you. You don't really mean that. You're just upset, and rightfully so. But sending your own son to prison won't solve anything. Think about what Dorothy would want. Would she want her grandson to go to jail over a misunderstanding about jewelry? Mother would want justice for the people who stole from her daughter and lied about her daughter's mental capacity to commit fraud. And Meredith? Stop using my mother's name to manipulate me. I hung up and immediately called Harold to report the conversation. He listened carefully, then made a suggestion that surprised me. Patricia, I think we should accelerate our timeline. Given what you've just told me, I'm concerned they might try to have you involuntarily committed or declared incompetent before we can complete our legal actions. Can they do that? If they could convince a doctor that you were mentally unfit, and if they presented the forged trust documents as evidence of your wishes, they might be able to initiate proceedings. It's unlikely to succeed given that the documents are fraudulent, but the process itself could tie up your assets and rights for months. That afternoon's appointment with Dr. Martinez was unlike any medical visit I'd ever experienced. She conducted extensive cognitive tests, memory assessments, and psychological evaluation. She also documented my physical health, my ability to manage my own affairs, and my understanding of the legal situation I was facing. Patricia, I want to be absolutely clear in my documentation. You are cognitively intact, mentally competent, and fully capable of managing your own affairs. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and your understanding of complex situations is completely normal. I'm going to prepare a detailed report that should protect you from any attempts to question your competency. As I was leaving her office, my phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera app. 2 people were approaching my front door. Daniel and a woman I didn't recognize. They were accompanied by someone in what looked like medical scrubs. I sat in my car in the doctor's parking lot and watched through the app as Daniel knocked on my door, then tried his key again when I didn't answer. The woman with him appeared to be taking notes, while the person in scrubs waited nearby with a clipboard. When they realized I wasn't home, I watched Daniel walk around to the back of the house and try the rear door. The woman made more notes, and they all stood in my backyard for several minutes, pointing at windows and discussing something I couldn't hear. I called Harold immediately. They're at my house with what looks like a social worker or medical professional. Harold, I think they're trying to have me declared incompetent. Don't go home yet. Drive straight to my office. We're going to file emergency motions for restraining orders and expedite the criminal charges. This stops now. For the next 3 hours, I sat in Harold's office while he worked with Frank Morrison and the prosecutor's office to arrange immediate arrests. The evidence of Daniel and Meredith's crimes was overwhelming. Forged documents, stolen money, fraudulent applications, and now what appeared to be an attempt to have me involuntarily committed. Patricia, Harold said as he finished a phone call, arrests will be made this evening. Given the ongoing nature of their crimes and the evidence that they're continuing to target you, they'll likely be held without bail until trial. How long will that take? Months. Possibly a year or more. But the important thing is that you'll be safe and they won't be able to access any of your accounts or property. That evening, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, watching the camera feeds on my phone. At 7:30, police cars arrived in my driveway. I watched through the app as Frank Morrison and several officers approached my front door. I let them in, noting how strange it felt to be welcoming police into my home as the victim rather than the suspect. Mrs. Holbrook, we have arrest warrants for Daniel and Meredith. We also have a search warrant for their home to look for additional evidence of fraudulent documents and stolen property. We wanted to let you know before we proceed. What happens now? They'll be arrested, booked, and held pending arraignment. Given the severity and ongoing nature of the charges, we'll be requesting that bail be denied. Your attorney can explain the rest of the process. After the police left, I found myself alone in my house for the first time in days without feeling afraid. The cameras still monitored every entrance. The new locks still secured every door. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly safe. My phone rang around 9 o'clock. The caller ID showed the county jail, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won out. Mom! Daniel's voice was small, defeated. Nothing like the confident manipulation I'd grown accustomed to hearing from him. Daniel. Mom, I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you, but you did hurt me. You systematically planned to take everything I owned. You lied about my mental capacity. You put my home at risk, and you tried to have me declared incompetent when I started fighting back. I was desperate, Mom. We were going to lose everything. I thought if we could just access some of the value in Grandma's jewelry, we could solve our problems and you'd never have to know. You thought you could steal from me and I'd never notice. I thought I could borrow against assets that would be mine eventually anyway. I never saw it as stealing. Daniel, everything you took was mine while I was still alive to need it. You didn't borrow, you stole. You didn't plan for inheritance. You planned for theft, and when I discovered what you were doing, instead of apologizing and trying to make it right, you escalated to trying to have me committed. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Mom, is there anything I can do to fix this? You can confess to everything. Plead guilty and serve whatever sentence the court gives you. You can stop lying and manipulating and trying to make yourself the victim. And Daniel, you can stop calling me and trying to get me to rescue you from the consequences of your choices. You're really going to let me go to prison? I'm not sending you to prison. Your crimes are sending you to prison. I'm just refusing to help you escape justice. After I hung up, I walked through my house turning off lights and checking locks. In Mother's room, I opened the jewelry box one more time and looked at the pieces that had inadvertently saved my life. If Daniel and Meredith had targeted something less visible, bank accounts, investment funds, even the house itself, I might never have discovered their scheme until it was too late. The pearls gleamed in the lamplight. The same pearls that had marked my parents' wedding day. The charm bracelet caught the light, each tiny symbol representing a moment of joy in Mother's life. The diamond brooch seemed to wink at me, as if sharing a secret. These pieces had protected me not through their value but through their visibility. By targeting them specifically, Daniel and Meredith had revealed the full scope of their betrayal in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. I closed the jewelry box and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal process moved forward. But tonight, for the first time in a week, I would sleep peacefully in my own home, protected by locks and cameras and the knowledge that the people who had tried to destroy my life were now facing the tollkins of their choices. The last thing I did before turning out the lights was check the camera app one more time. My house was secure, my property was protected, and my future was my own again. Sometimes justice doesn't come in the form you expect, but it comes nonetheless. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse hallway watching my son being led away in handcuffs. Daniel had just been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and identity theft. Meredith received 5 years due to her role as the primary architect of the scheme and her previous criminal record, something we'd discovered during the investigation that neither Daniel nor I had known about. The trial had been exhausting but ultimately vindicating. Rebecca Williams, the supposed jewelry appraiser, had testified as part of a plea agreement that detailed exactly how their scheme worked. She'd targeted elderly homeowners through their adult children, identifying valuable assets and then helping the children defraud insurance companies, banks, and credit institutions to access those assets prematurely. In most cases, she'd testified, the elderly victims died or were placed in care facilities before discovering the fraud. Mrs. Holbrook was unusual because she remained alert and independent long enough to uncover what was happening. The prosecutor had used Rebecca's testimony to paint a picture of systematic elder abuse that extended far beyond my case. Daniel and Meredith were part of a network that had defrauded dozens of families across 3 states, stealing an estimated $2.3 million from elderly victims over 2 years. During the sentencing hearing, I'd been given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. I'd spent weeks preparing what I wanted to say, practicing in my living room until I could deliver it without breaking down. Your Honor, I'd said, looking directly at Daniel while I spoke, the defendant is my son, and I loved him with everything I had for 35 years. But the person who committed these crimes against me used that love as a weapon. He counted on my trust, my grief, and my desire to maintain family relationships to hide his systematic theft of my security, my independence, and my dignity. The financial damage was significant. My credit was destroyed, my home was put at risk, and my retirement security was threatened, but the emotional damage was worse. This man taught me that I couldn't trust my own judgment about the people closest to me. He made me question whether the love I thought we shared was real, or whether I was simply a resource to be managed until I was no longer useful. I'm not asking for mercy for him because he's my son. I'm asking for justice because he's a criminal who targeted vulnerable elderly people and used family relationships to cover his crimes. If he receives a lenient sentence because we're related, what message does that send to other adults who might consider exploiting their aging parents? Daniel had looked away during most of my statement, but when I'd finished, he'd met my eyes for just a moment. What I saw there wasn't remorse or understanding, it was resentment. Even facing prison, he still seemed to believe he was the victim of my unreasonable response to his reasonable actions. That look had eliminated any lingering doubts I might have had about pressing charges. Now, walking out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph or satisfaction, but a deep, clean sadness. I was grieving not just for the son I'd lost, but for the son I'd thought I had in the first place. Harold walked beside me, carrying a briefcase full of documents related to the restitution Daniel and Meredith would be required to pay. The court had ordered them to repay every penny they'd stolen, plus interest and penalties, though Harold had warned me that collecting would likely take years. Patricia, you should know that the FBI has asked to interview you about other potential victims. Your case broke open a much larger investigation. I'd agreed to help however I could. Over the past months, I'd been contacted by 3 other elderly people whose adult children had targeted them using similar methods. In each case, my story had helped them understand that what happened to them wasn't their fault, wasn't a family matter to be handled privately, and wasn't something they should be ashamed about. One of those contacts had led to an unexpected friendship. Eleanor Hartfield was a 72-year-old widow from Minnesota whose daughter had stolen $45,000 from her retirement accounts using forged power of attorney documents. Eleanor had discovered the theft only when her bank called to verify an unusually large withdrawal. The hardest part, Eleanor had told me during one of our weekly phone calls, wasn't the money. I realized that my daughter had been planning this for months while I was making her dinner every Sunday and helping her pay her car insurance. Eleanor and I had started a small support group for elder fraud victims, meeting monthly at the community center. What we discovered was that most of the victims were women. Most of the perpetrators were adult children or grandchildren, and most of the crimes went unreported because families pressured the victims to keep it private. It's not about the money, I'd tell new group members. It's about realizing that someone you loved and trusted saw you as a commodity rather than a person. That's a grief that doesn't have a timeline. The support group had given me a sense of purpose that I'd been missing since Mother's death. For the first time in years, I felt like I was contributing something meaningful to the world, rather than just marking time until my own death. I'd also made practical changes to my life that reflected my new understanding of my own strength and independence. The cameras that I'd initially installed for security had shown me how much I enjoyed having a complete record of my daily life. I'd expanded the system and started keeping detailed video journals, documenting my thoughts and experiences for potential future generations who might want to understand what their grandmother or great-grandmother had been like. The jewelry that had inadvertently saved my life had been properly appraised and insured, but more importantly, I'd started wearing pieces regularly instead of keeping them locked away. Mother's pearl earrings had become my everyday favorites, and I'd taken to wearing her charm bracelet when I gardened, adding new charms to mark my own milestones and achievements. 6 weeks after the sentencing, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Daniel, postmarked from the federal prison, where he was serving his sentence. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity won out. "Dear Mom," it began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but my counselor here says that making amends is part of recovery. I've been going to sessions about financial addiction and learning about how I justified what I did to you. I want you to know that I finally understand that what we did was wrong. Not just illegal, but morally wrong. We treated you like you were already dead, like your life and wishes and feelings didn't matter. We convinced ourselves that we deserved your money and property more than you did, and we used your love for me to hide what we were doing. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not asking you to visit or write back. I just wanted you to know that I see it clearly now. You raised me to be better than this, and I chose to ignore everything you taught me about honesty and respect and treating people with dignity. I hope you're living well, and that you found peace after everything we put you through. You deserved so much better from me." The letter was signed simply Daniel, with no endearments or expectation of response. I read it 3 times, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity, but found none. It seemed like a genuinely remorseful acknowledgement of responsibility, the kind of letter I'd hoped to receive months earlier, but had stopped expecting. I didn't write back, but I did file the letter in the folder where I kept all the legal documents from the case. Someday, I might be ready to respond. Today was not that day. That evening, I did something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I called my neighbor Margaret Chen and asked if she'd like to have dinner with me the following week. "Patricia, are you asking me on a date?" Margaret asked with amusement in her voice. "I'm asking if you'd like to spend time with someone who's finally figured out the difference between being alone and being lonely." Margaret and I had been friends for years, but our friendship had deepened considerably during the months when I was dealing with Daniel's betrayal. She'd been a steady source of practical advice and emotional support, never making me feel foolish for trusting my son or weak for feeling hurt by his betrayal. Our dinner led to regular weekly meals together, which led to traveling together to visit Eleanor and other members of our support group network. Margaret had retired from her paralegal career, but retained a sharp mind for legal issues and a talent for helping people navigate complex, bureaucratic systems. "We make a good team," she'd observed one afternoon, as we helped a 90-year-old man in our support group file police reports against his grandson, who'd been stealing his Social Security checks. You understand the emotional side of family betrayal, and I understand the legal mechanisms that can stop it. By the 1-year anniversary of discovering Daniel's insurance fraud, I'd built a life that was fuller and more purposeful than anything I'd experienced since my husband died. The support group had grown to 15 regular members and had successfully helped prevent 3 additional elder fraud schemes by teaching potential victims what warning signs to watch for. I'd also started speaking at senior centers and community groups about financial protection for elderly people. My presentation always began the same way. If you think your adult children would never steal from you, you're exactly the kind of trusting parent that criminals target. The response was always the same: uncomfortable shifting in seats, nervous laughter, and then a flood of questions from people who'd noticed warning signs they'd been afraid to acknowledge. On the anniversary evening, I sat in Mother's room looking through her jewelry box one final time, before relocating it to my own bedroom. I'd decided that keeping her things in what had essentially become a shrine wasn't honoring her memory. It was avoiding the reality that life continues after loss. As I lifted each piece, I thought about the stories Mother had told me about them, and the new stories I was creating by wearing them and living with them. The charm bracelet now included a small gavel charm I'd added after Daniel's sentencing, and a tiny camera charm that Margaret had given me to commemorate my new vigilance. The pearl necklace had been restrung with a stronger clasp after I'd worn it to testify at Daniel's trial. The diamond brooch had been reset in a more modern style that I actually enjoyed wearing to community presentations. These pieces were no longer just repositories of the past, they were tools for building the future. I wanted to live. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Patricia, just got word that my daughter's restitution check cleared. $45,000 back in my account after 18 months. Justice is slow, but it's real." I smiled and texted back, "Congratulations, what are you going to do with your freedom money?" "Taking that cruise to Alaska I've been talking about. Life's too short to wait for other people's permission to enjoy it." Eleanor was right. For too many years, I'd been living a life constrained by other people's expectations and needs, putting my own desires on hold while I waited for the right time, the right circumstances, the right approval from family members who turned out to have their own agendas. The fraud case had ended, the legal issues were resolved, and the family relationships were permanently changed. But most importantly, I discovered that I was stronger, more capable, and more independent than I'd ever imagined. I'd learned to protect myself, to trust my instincts, and to build new relationships based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. That night, I made a list of things I wanted to accomplish in the coming year. Places I wanted to travel, people I wanted to help, experiences I wanted to have. For the first time since my husband's death, I was planning a future based on my own desires rather than simply managing the present until it ended. At the top of the list, I wrote, "Live like someone who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." It had taken my own son's betrayal to teach me that lesson, but it was a lesson worth learning, even at such a painful cost. The cameras still monitored my home, the locks still secured my doors, and Mother's jewelry still gleamed in its new home in my bedroom. But now, these things represented not just protection from external threats. They represented the tools and treasures of a woman who'd learned to value herself enough to fight for the life she deserved to live. Some stories end with reconciliation and forgiveness. This one ended with something more valuable: the understanding that some relationships aren't worth preserving if they require you to sacrifice your safety, dignity, or independence. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go, and the greatest act of strength is building a new life from the ashes of the old one. I never saw Daniel again after that day in the courthouse, but I saw myself clearly for the first time in years, and that turned out to be the most important relationship I could possibly repair. 2 years after the sentencing, my life had transformed in ways I never could have anticipated. The support group Eleanor and I had started with just 3 members now had chapters in 7 states, with over 200 elderly fraud victims sharing their stories and healing together. We'd even gotten the attention of federal lawmakers who invited us to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the scope of elder financial abuse. Standing in that marble-columned hearing room in Washington, D.C., wearing Mother's diamond brooch pinned to my navy blue suit, I felt the weight of representing not just myself but hundreds of other victims whose voices had been silenced by shame and family pressure. "Senators," I'd begun, my voice steady despite the cameras and the formality of the setting. "Elder financial abuse is not just a crime against individuals, it's a crime against the very foundation of trust that holds families together. When adult children steal from their aging parents, they're not just taking money, they're destroying the belief that love and family loyalty have any meaning." The subcommittee chair, Senator Martinez from Texas, had leaned forward as I spoke. "Mrs. Holbrook, in your experience, what prevents most victims from reporting these crimes?" "Fear, shame, and a misguided belief that family business should stay private. Victims often feel responsible for trusting the wrong people, even when those people are their own children. They'd rather lose their life savings than admit publicly that they raised someone capable of stealing from them." The hearing had led to new federal legislation requiring banks and financial institutions to implement better safeguards against elder fraud. More importantly, it connected me with advocacy organizations across the country who were fighting similar battles. One of those connections had changed my life in an unexpected way. Dr. Janet Reeves was a gerontologist from Portland who'd been studying patterns of elder abuse for 15 years. She'd contacted me after seeing my congressional testimony, asking if I'd be interested in collaborating on a research project documenting the long-term psychological effects of family financial abuse. "Patricia, your case is unique because you caught the fraud early and fought back successfully. Most of our research focuses on victims who discovered the abuse too late or who were too intimidated to pursue justice. We need to understand what factors enabled your recovery so we can help other victims follow a similar path." Working with Janet has given me a chance to understand my own experience in a broader context. Through our interviews and research, I'd come to realize that my recovery hadn't been just about legal justice or financial restitution. It had been about reclaiming my right to control my own narrative. Many elder abuse victims internalize the message that their burdens, that their lives are essentially over and they should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention or care their families provide. Janet had explained during one of our research sessions, "Your case demonstrates that it's possible to reject that narrative and build a new identity based on strength rather than vulnerability." The research project had evolved into something larger, a comprehensive guide for elder abuse survivors that combined legal advice, psychological support strategies, and practical steps for rebuilding after betrayal. We'd titled it, "Reclaiming Your Voice: A Survivor's Guide to Elder Financial Abuse Recovery." The book had been published 6 months ago, and the response had been overwhelming. I received letters daily from readers who said our guidance had helped them recognize abuse in their own lives, or find the courage to report crimes they'd been hiding. Many of those letters came from people whose situations were far worse than mine had been. Sarah Chen, no relation to my neighbor Margaret, had written from California, "My son stole $380,000 from my retirement accounts over 3 years. I only discovered it when I tried to withdraw money for cancer treatment and found the accounts empty. I was so ashamed that I told no one, not even my doctor. Your book helped me understand that his crimes weren't my fault and that I deserve justice regardless of our relationship. I filed police reports last week." Another letter came from Robert Martinez in Florida. "My daughter convinced me to sign power of attorney papers when I was grieving my wife's death. She used that authority to sell my house and move me into a nursing home, keeping all the proceeds for herself. I thought I had no recourse because I'd signed the papers willingly. Your chapter on coercion and undue influence showed me that willingness obtained through manipulation isn't real consent. I'm fighting back now." Each letter reminded me that my experience, as painful as it had been, had equipped me to help others in ways I never could have imagined when I was sitting in my kitchen reading that first insurance fraud letter. The speaking engagements had multiplied as well. I now travel regularly to present at conferences for social workers, elder law attorneys, and law enforcement officers who work with elderly victims. One of my most memorable presentations had been to a group of police detectives in Chicago who specialized in financial crimes. The biggest challenge in elder abuse cases, I'd told them, is that the victims often don't want to cooperate with prosecution. They've been conditioned to believe that protecting family relationships is more important than protecting themselves. You need to understand that reporting their own children feels like a betrayal of everything they believe about motherhood and family loyalty. Detective Williams, a 20-year veteran of the Chicago police force, had raised her hand. What changed your mind? What made you decide to press charges despite that conditioning? I realized that enabling my son's criminal behavior wasn't protecting him. It was ensuring that he'd continue hurting people. By holding him accountable, I was potentially saving other elderly people from becoming his victims. That shifted my perspective from feeling like a vindictive mother to feeling like a responsible citizen. Those presentations had led to consulting work with police departments and prosecutors' offices, helping them develop better approaches to elder abuse cases. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply satisfying. Every case we helped solve felt like a small victory against the forces that had nearly destroyed my own life. Margaret Chen had become my closest confidant and travel companion during these professional endeavors. Her paralegal background made her invaluable for understanding the legal complexities we encountered, while her dry sense of humor kept me grounded when the emotional weight of other people's tragedies threatened to overwhelm me. You know, she'd observed one evening, as we sat in a hotel restaurant in Denver after a particularly intense conference presentation, you've become the person you needed when Daniel was targeting you. That's not a coincidence. She was right. The advocacy work, the research project, the speaking engagements, they were all ways of reaching back to help the woman I'd been 2 years ago, the one who'd sat in her kitchen wondering if she was losing her mind or if her son was really stealing from her. The financial recovery had been slower but ultimately successful. Daniel and Meredith's restitution payments had restored most of what they'd stolen, though the process had taken nearly 2 years and had required constant legal pressure. More importantly, the improvements I'd made to my financial security systems had left me better protected than I'd ever been before. I'd worked with a financial advisor who specialized in elder financial protection to create multiple safeguards against future fraud. All major transactions now required dual authorization from both myself and Harold Peterson. My accounts were monitored by fraud detection services that would alert me to any unusual activity within hours. I'd also established a small trust fund that would provide for my care if I ever became incapacitated, removing any financial incentive for family members to manipulate my medical care for gain. The goal, my financial advisor had explained, is to make you an unattractive target for financial predators, while ensuring you maintain complete control over your assets as long as you're competent. Those protections had given me the confidence to be more generous with organizations and causes I cared about. I donated significantly to elder abuse prevention programs, funded scholarships for social work students studying gerontology, and established a small foundation that provided emergency financial assistance to elder fraud victims while they pursued legal remedies. The generosity felt good in a way that hoarding my resources out of fear never had. I was using my financial security to build something meaningful rather than just protecting it from potential thieves. On a personal level, the past 2 years had brought unexpected joys. Margaret and I had traveled to Alaska, inspired by Eleanor's cruise, visited the Grand Canyon, and spent a wonderful week in Ireland tracing my mother's family genealogy. Each trip has reinforced my growing understanding that life doesn't end at 64, it just enters a different phase, one that can be rich with new experiences if you're brave enough to pursue them. I'd also reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during the years when I was focused on caring for Mother and then grieving her loss. My high school friend Linda Morrison had reached out after reading an article about my congressional testimony, and we'd rekindled a friendship that had enriched both our lives. Patricia, you were always the strongest person in our class, Linda had told me during one of our monthly lunch dates. I'm not surprised you fought back against your son's fraud, but I am amazed at how you've turned that terrible experience into something that helps other people. The personal relationships I'd built over the past 2 years were based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than obligation or dependency. I'd learned to value people who valued me, and to distance myself from those who saw me primarily as a resource to be managed or manipulated. 3 weeks ago, I received another letter from Daniel. This one was different from his previous correspondence. Longer, more detailed, and clearly the result of extensive therapy and self-reflection. Mom, he'd written, I've been working with a counselor who specializes in financial addiction and family abuse. I'm beginning to understand not just what I did wrong, but why I was able to justify it to myself for so long. I convinced myself that your life was essentially over, that you were just marking time until death, and that made it easier to see your resources as mine to manage. I never considered that you might have plans, dreams, or goals of your own that required financial security. I saw you as a placeholder rather than a person. The therapy has helped me recognize that this attitude didn't develop overnight. I'd been trained by society, by the media, by subtle family dynamics to see older women as burdens rather than human beings with their own agency and desires. That doesn't excuse what I did, but it helps me understand how I became someone capable of doing it. I know you've built a new life and found purpose in helping other people avoid what I put you through. I'm proud of you for that, even though I have no right to claim any connection to your success. What you've accomplished, despite me. Not because of me. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for a relationship when I'm released. I just wanted you to know that I see clearly now what I destroyed, and I'm committed to spending the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the mother who raised me. This letter had been signed Daniel as well, but it carried a weight and sincerity that his previous correspondence had lacked. I'd found myself crying after reading it, not tears of forgiveness or reconciliation, but tears of grief for the relationship we might have had if he'd been capable of this level of honesty and self-awareness before he'd chosen to betray me. I'd shown the letter to Dr. Reeves during our last research session. What do you think? I'd asked. Is this genuine growth or sophisticated manipulation? It sounds genuine to me, she'd replied, but the more important question is whether it matters. Regardless of Daniel's psychological state, you've built a life that doesn't depend on his redemption or approval. That's the real measure of your recovery. She was right. 2 years ago, a letter like this would have consumed my thoughts for weeks, as I tried to decide whether to respond, and what such a response might mean for our relationship. Now I could acknowledge his apparent growth while maintaining the boundaries that protected my own peace of mind. Yesterday marked exactly 2 years since Daniel's sentencing, and I'd spent the evening reflecting on how completely my life had changed. I was sitting in Mother's old room, now converted into a home office where I wrote victim advocacy articles and managed the support group network, wearing her pearl earrings and working on a presentation for next week's conference on elder rights. The jewelry box sat on a shelf nearby, no longer hidden away but integrated into my daily environment. I'd added several pieces of my own over the past 2 years, a watch I'd bought myself to commemorate finishing the book, a ring Margaret had given me for my 66th birthday, earrings I'd purchased during our trip to Ireland. The collection was growing again, not through inheritance or gifts from people seeking to control me, but through my own choices and achievements. Each new piece represented a milestone in my recovery and independence. As I worked on my presentation, my phone rang. It was Eleanor, calling from Alaska, where she was leading a support group retreat for elder abuse survivors. Patricia, you'll never guess what happened today. One of the retreat participants, a woman whose grandson stole her house, just got word that he's being extradited back to Alaska to face federal charges. She said your chapter on persistence in the book gave her the courage to keep pushing for prosecution even when the local police told her it was a civil matter. These were the moments that made all the difficult work worthwhile, knowing that my experience had prevented another criminal from escaping justice, had given another victim the tools to fight back, had shown another elderly person that they deserved respect and protection, regardless of their age. As we talked, I looked out the window at the lake where I'd lived for over 30 years. The water reflected the evening sky, peaceful and eternal, just as it had been before Daniel's betrayal, and just as it would be long after all of us were gone. But I was no longer the same woman who had looked out at that lake 2 years ago. I was stronger, more purposeful, and more connected to a community of people who understood both survival and service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help other victims, new chances to build on the life I'd reclaimed from the ashes of family betrayal. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, surrounded by my own choices, protected by my own strength, and committed to using my experience to light the way for others who were still finding their path back to themselves. The following morning brought an unexpected phone call that would open yet another chapter in my journey. It was from Detective Sarah Williams, the Chicago police officer I'd worked with on several cases. Her voice carried an excitement I'd rarely heard from her. "Patricia, we've just broken open what might be the largest elder fraud ring in Illinois history. 12 families were affected, over $2 million stolen. And it all started because one of the victims read your book and recognized the patterns. The victim was Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, an 80-year-old widow whose daughter-in-law had been systematically draining her accounts for over a year. Helen had been too ashamed to report it until she'd read the chapter about family manipulation in Reclaiming Your Voice. She called us last week," Detective Williams continued, "and when we started investigating, we discovered her daughter-in-law was part of an organized network. They target elderly people through their own family members, just like what happened to you, but on a much larger scale. The investigation had uncovered a sophisticated operation involving crooked lawyers, complicit medical professionals, and even funeral directors who provided inside information about recently widowed seniors. The scope was staggering, and law enforcement needed someone with my experience to help them understand the psychological manipulation tactics being used. We need you to consult on this case, Patricia. These criminals are using emotional weapons that traditional investigators don't fully understand. Your insight into family dynamics and victim psychology could be crucial." I accepted immediately. Over the next 3 months, I worked closely with federal investigators, reviewing evidence, interviewing victims, and helping develop prosecution strategies. The work was emotionally draining but professionally fulfilling in ways I'd never imagined. One of the most disturbing discoveries was how the criminal network recruited family members to target their own elderly relatives. They would identify adult children or grandchildren who were struggling financially, then provide them with scripts and techniques for manipulating their aging family members. "It's like they had a playbook for destroying family trust," I explained to the federal prosecutor handling the case. "They taught these family members exactly what emotional buttons to push, what fears to exploit, and how to gradually isolate their victims from outside support." The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, had been initially skeptical about bringing in a civilian consultant. But, as we worked together, he came to understand the unique value of my perspective. "Patricia, you've lived through this kind of betrayal and come out stronger. When you explain to juries what it feels like to discover your own child has been stealing from you, they understand the true damage these crimes cause in ways that financial records alone can't convey." The trial lasted 6 weeks and resulted in convictions for all 12 defendants. More importantly, it established legal precedents that would make future prosecutions easier and sentences more severe. The lead organizer, a woman named Victoria Blackwood, who had recruited dozens of family members to defraud their elderly relatives, received a 20-year federal sentence. During her sentencing hearing, I had the opportunity to speak on behalf of all the victims. Standing at that podium, I thought about the journey that had brought me there, from a confused, frightened woman reading an insurance fraud letter to someone who could help bring down criminal networks that preyed on vulnerable seniors. "Your Honor," I had said, "the defendant didn't just steal money from her victims. She weaponized love itself, turning the most sacred of human bonds into tools for exploitation. She taught children to view their parents as resources rather than people. And she profited from the destruction of families that took generations to build." The Blackwood case had attracted national media attention, and suddenly I found myself being interviewed by news programs, podcasts, and documentary filmmakers. The exposure was uncomfortable at first, but I recognized it as an opportunity to reach even more potential victims and their families. One interview that particularly moved me was with an investigative journalist named Rachel Kim, who was producing a documentary about elder fraud for a major streaming service. During our conversation, she asked me a question that forced me to articulate something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully recognized. Patricia, you've become one of the leading advocates in this field. But it all started with your personal tragedy. Do you ever wish Daniel's crimes had never happened? Do you wish you were still just a grandmother living quietly by the lake? I had to think carefully before answering. That's like asking if I wish I'd never discovered who my son really was. The crimes caused tremendous pain, but they also revealed truths I needed to know. I wouldn't choose to go through it again, but I wouldn't choose to go back to the ignorance I lived in before it happened. The woman I was 3 years ago was vulnerable because she was naive. She trusted without boundaries, loved without conditions, and gave without limits. Those qualities aren't necessarily bad, but they become dangerous when other people exploit them. The woman I am now has learned to love wisely, trust carefully, and give strategically. I'm not harder or colder, I'm smarter. The documentary, titled Blood Money, When Family Becomes the Enemy, premiered 8 months later and reached millions of viewers. I received thousands of emails and letters from people who said watching it had helped them recognize abuse in their own lives, or find the courage to seek help. One letter particularly touched me. It was from a man named James Patterson, in Seattle, whose brother had been stealing from their 90-year-old mother for 2 years. Miss Holbrook, he wrote, I knew something was wrong when my mother started talking about being broke despite having a good pension and savings. But my brother is charming and convincing, and he always had explanations for why Mom needed money. After watching your documentary, I recognized the patterns you described and convinced Mom to let me look at her finances. My brother had stolen over $200,000. We filed charges yesterday. Thank you for showing us that family crimes are still crimes. The media exposure had also brought unexpected personal connections. I'd been contacted by other survivors who had built advocacy careers from their own traumatic experiences. Dr. Angela Morrison was a psychologist who'd survived domestic abuse and now specialized in helping other survivors. Maria Santos was a former sex trafficking victim who'd become a federal prosecutor. Detective Lisa Chen, Margaret's cousin, coincidentally had survived childhood abuse and now led a specialized unit investigating crimes against children. We're part of an unusual sorority, Angela had observed during a conference where we'd all been speakers. Women who've transformed their worst experiences into their greatest contribution. It's not a club anyone wants to join, but once you're in it, you realize the power that comes from using your pain to prevent other people's suffering. These connections had led to collaborative projects that expanded my impact beyond elder fraud. We'd worked together on legislation, addressing victim rights across multiple categories of family violence, developed training programs for law enforcement and social workers, and created resources for survivors dealing with the psychological aftermath of betrayal by loved ones. The work had also brought opportunities I'd never imagined. Harvard Law School had invited me to teach a seminar on victim advocacy and criminal justice. The United Nations had asked me to participate in an international conference on elder abuse prevention. The American Bar Association had given me their Outstanding Citizen Advocate Award. Each recognition felt surreal to someone who'd been a relatively quiet widow just 3 years earlier, but they also validated the importance of the work and provided platforms to reach even larger audiences. Meanwhile, my personal life has continued to flourish in unexpected ways. Margaret and I had formalized our partnership by buying a small vacation home together in the mountains of North Carolina. It served as a retreat where we could escape the intensity of advocacy work and simply enjoy each other's company. You know, Margaret had said, one evening, as we sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset, when I retired from law, I thought my most productive years were behind me. Working with you has shown me that some of our most important work happens after traditional career expectations end. I'd also developed a surrogate grandmother relationship with Detective Williams' 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Sarah had mentioned during one of our case consultations that Emma was struggling with anxiety about whether her own grandmother was safe living alone. This had led to my volunteering to speak at Emma's school about senior safety, which had evolved into regular visits and a genuine friendship. Mrs. Patricia, Emma had said during one of our recent visits. My mom says you help catch bad guys who hurt grandparents. That's like being a superhero for old people. Out of the mouths of babes. Emma's innocent perspective had helped me see my work through fresh eyes, not as recovering from victimization, but as actively protecting vulnerable people who deserved safety and dignity. The 5th anniversary of discovering Daniel's insurance fraud had passed last month, and I'd marked it by visiting Eleanor in Minnesota. Now in her 70s, she'd become a mentor figure in our support group network, known for her practical wisdom and gentle humor. Patricia, she'd said, as we sat in her garden, surrounded by the flowers she'd planted with money, reclaimed from her daughter's fraud. Do you ever think about forgiveness? Not for them, but for yourself? It was a question I'd been grappling with more frequently as the years passed. Not forgiveness for Daniel and Meredith, they'd caused their own consequences and would have to live with them, but forgiveness for myself, for the mother who'd raised a son, capable of such betrayal, for the woman who'd been naive enough to trust without verification. I think I've moved beyond needing forgiveness, I'd answered after careful consideration. What happened to me wasn't my fault, and my response to it has created something meaningful. I'm not angry anymore. Not at them, not at myself, not at the situation. I'm just grateful that I was strong enough to survive it and wise enough to learn from it. Eleanor nodded approvingly. That's the real victory, isn't it? Not just surviving, but thriving, not just healing, but helping others heal. Last week brought news that Daniel was being released early for good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. His parole officer had contacted me as a courtesy, asking if I had any concerns about his release. I'd thought carefully before responding. I have no desire for contact with him, but I'm not afraid of him either. He's served his time and hopefully learned from it. What happens next is up to him. The news had prompted me to reflect on how completely my relationship with fear had changed. 3 years ago, the thought of Daniel being free would have terrified me. Now it was simply a fact to be noted and planned around. I'd built a life so secure, so surrounded by supportive people and protective systems, that his presence or absence in the world no longer had the power to destabilize me. That evolution from fear to indifference felt like the final stage of my recovery. I no longer needed to actively fight against Daniel's influence because I'd moved so far beyond his reach that he simply wasn't relevant to my daily existence. This morning, I'd received an email that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. It was from the director of the National Center on Elder Abuse, inviting me to serve on their board of directors. The position would involve helping shape national policy on elder protection, overseeing research initiatives, and representing victims' perspectives in congressional hearings. Mrs. Holbrook, the email read, your unique combination of personal experience, advocacy expertise, and media platform makes you an ideal candidate to help lead the national conversation on elder abuse prevention. We believe your voice could influence legislation that protects millions of vulnerable seniors. I accepted the position immediately. The work would be challenging and time-consuming, but it represented the culmination of everything I'd been building towards since that first terrifying day when I discovered my son's betrayal. Tonight, as I prepared for bed in the home I'd successfully defended against those who would have taken it from me, I looked once more at Mother's jewelry box. The pieces inside still gleamed as beautifully as they had the day she died, but their meaning had evolved far beyond their original purpose. They were no longer just symbols of love and celebration from the past. They had become talismans of strength and survival, reminders that some things are worth fighting for, and proof that a woman's value extends far beyond what others might try to take from her. I selected the pearl earrings for tomorrow's board meeting. Mother would have been proud to know that her daughter was wearing her pearls while helping protect other families from the kind of betrayal that had once threatened to destroy our own legacy. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not just surviving Daniel's crimes, but ensuring that Mother's memory lived on in service to others rather than being forever tainted by the greed that had targeted her treasures. Some endings are about returning to what was lost. This one was about moving forward to what was possible, and the possibilities I'd learned were limitless when you finally understood your own worth. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.